So everything Wolverine has going on in Marvel Comics right now since the ending of the Age of Krakoa is surprisingly easy to follow, and most all of it takes place in his solo series. I will specify, he is currently a part of Gail Simone's Uncanny X-Men team, but the reality is that he's just kind of a side-along character. He's there with everybody else, but outside of a couple of small moments here and there really isn't much that he has going on, because the reality is that the main star of Uncanny X-Men are really Rogue and Gambit more than anything else. And so that's why we're going to be focusing for the most part on his solo series. And so once Krakoa came to an end, in effect, all bets were off. Anybody out there that had a grudge against the mutant population, it was open season. And there was one guy above all others that had a grudge against not just Wolverine, but the mutant population as a whole, and that was Sabretooth. And so that's why almost immediately after the Krakoa era ends, Wolverine finds himself immersed in something called the Sabretooth War. So to provide some context here, the reason why Sabretooth had a vendetta against the mutant population as a whole, really more the X-Men universe, so X-Men, X-Force, X-Factor, that kind of thing, was because at the very beginning of the Krakoa age, Sabretooth was basically used to achieve a goal, specifically gaining information on the mutant population that was being held by the human population at damage control. For the most part, he was able to achieve his goal, but number one, he killed humans, which was a law that you could not violate as far as Krakoa was concerned, and number two, he was caught. And so eventually he was brought back to Krakoa, and then he was confined to the pit, which was basically this inescapable prison within Krakoa itself. But from the perspective of Sabretooth, he saw it as hypocrisy in the sense that the X-Men and the Quiet Council, so the governing body of Krakoa, used him, and then as soon as they didn't need him anymore, they just deemed him too dangerous and threw him away. And for the most part, throughout pretty much the entire age of Krakoa, he remained there. He didn't really get out. There were all kinds of adventures that happened with him. We have covered that. But the point is, by the time Krakoa came to an end, he had already escaped the pit. And that's when he was apprehended by Orcus, who was basically the chief villain of the mutant population during the age of Krakoa. What Sabretooth ended up realizing was that his son, Graydon Creed, had actually been jumping through the multiverse, capturing or killing every version of Sabretooth he could find. The idea being that Graydon wanted to bring all these different versions of Sabretooth together, the ones that he didn't kill, and then basically use them to destroy Sabretooth, who some of you guys may know is the father of Graydon Creed. And so while Sabretooth was successful in defeating Graydon, this allowed him to unite these different versions of himself that remained within the main Marvel universe that had been gathered from the multiverse, and then strike out against the mutant population. Target number one was Wolverine. And so by this point, Wolverine and his X-Force team had taken up residence in the North Pole in order to escape any and everybody that would inevitably be coming after them. It's important to know here, X-Force and the members of it aren't necessarily as capable as Wolverine insofar as, espionage and planning out strategic attacks and so on. They are, and there were some very powerful members there, Quentin Quire really being the most powerful of them. But Wolverine had been around enough times to know that whenever the mutant population was in a vulnerable state, any and everybody would come after them. And so when Sabretooth and his team make their move, the first person they go after is Quentin Quire, due to the fact that he's an Omega level telepath. They quite literally cut off his head and then use his head as a kind of weapon, both offensive and defensive, which is to say, subduing people or using it for mind control. The latter is the more important one here, because using Quentin Quire's head, who's technically still alive, even if on a psychic level, they use the powers of Quentin Quire to subdue Sage and Black Tom Cassidy. Sage being a mutant whose mind is basically a living computer. She remembers everything she sees. And Black Tom Cassidy, who controls plant life. But operating together, they're essentially the defense system for the X-Force base in the North Pole. And so with both of them basically taken over and taken out, it allows Sabretooth and his team to infiltrate. And at that point, they attack Daken. And this is really more of Sabretooth's personal vendetta, which is to say, there's a concept called birthday surprises when it comes to Sabretooth and Wolverine, meaning that every year on Wolverine's birthday, Sabretooth kills someone close to him. It might be a love interest, it might be a very close friend. In this particular instance, it's his son, which is why he literally takes the pieces of Daken and then writes, "Happy birthday, using his body parts. It's pretty gruesome. It's pretty gruesome. But in that moment, Wolverine realizes that they're under attack by Sabretooth. And with these different iterations of Sabretooth coming after him, Wolverine realizes the crisis is a lot bigger than he initially thought it was. Now, I do also want to bring in this bit of a conversation with Laura Kinney, X-23. She was a part of the team as well. And while she's not really the biological daughter of Wolverine, she might as well be. With the way that he's mentored her, the way that he treats her, talks to her, he basically treats her like a daughter. And so she is also captured by Sabretooth's team. Wolverine himself is actually strung up and just kind of left there, basically to deal with the personal torment of knowing that because so many members of the X-Force team have either been captured or killed, that seemingly he's responsible for it, right? It's basically Sabretooth's way of forcing Wolverine to acknowledge the fact he couldn't protect the people closest to him. And so Wolverine does exactly what you would expect him to do. He starts cutting himself free, and he does it in a pretty gruesome way. And at that point, it's on like Donkey Kong. Like he immediately goes on a campaign against Sabretooth and all of his forces. The problem is that as capable as Wolverine is, he simply just can't do it on his own. And even when he shows back up at the X-Force base, most everybody's gone. And so there's a few different plot threads that get pulled at the same time. Phoebe from the Stepford Cuckoos, Colossus, and Domino realize what's going on, and they show up on the scene. Now, the Stepford Cuckoos, they are a group that you have seen in X-Men 97, even if you didn't realize it. But the Stepford Cuckoos either exist as 3 or 5, because some members have died, come back over the years of Marvel Comics, that are effectively the clones of Emma Frost, but they operate as a kind of hive mind. Individually, they are powerful, but collectively, they are immensely powerful. And so with Domino, Colossus, Phoebe, and Wolverine all working together, they end up capturing one of the versions of Sabretooth that's essentially Captain America in a different reality. And alongside the help of Sage, they analyze his mind and realize what's going on, where these different versions of Sabretooth came from. At the same time that that's going on, because Quentin Quire is again still alive on a psychic level, he ends up sending out a message to a group called the Exiles. Now, if you're familiar with Marvel Comics, this is not the multiversal team of Exiles, which is to say the traditional team that literally travels the multiverse and encounters all different types of characters from across the multiverse. The original Exiles run was really cool, especially when you look at the World Tour storyline, and they revisit some of the most notable stories in Marvel's history that usually take place in an alternate future. But the Exiles that we're talking about here are actually a handful of mutants who had also been confined to the pit as well. And while they are aware of Sabretooth insofar that due to Sabretooth's time being in the pit, he had almost kind of developed these reality warping powers in the sense that he could control the pit itself, even though once he left, he was just back to his normal abilities. This new version of Exiles was essentially tormented by Sabretooth. And so once he got out and once they got out, they were really just kind of dealing and reeling with the aftermath of everything that had happened. While Quentin Quire had reached out to them telepathically and called for their aid. And so that's when they show up on the scene. So it's simply just to illustrate the fact that by the time you get to this final battle between Sabretooth and Wolverine, it's not really Wolverine operating by himself, right? On one hand, you have Colossus, Domino, and all those guys, basically X-Force, facing off against the forces of Sabretooth, and at the same time, you have Wolverine himself fighting Sabretooth directly. But what Wolverine needed was a permanent means of defeating Sabretooth, of essentially ending him. And so what we ended up learning was that at some point in time, Wolverine had hit up Forge, which if you're not familiar with this character, although I imagine you probably are because of X-Men 97, Forge is a mutant whose ability basically makes him Tony Stark, if we're doing like a really simple explanation here. I mean, there's definitely more to his powers than that, but that's just the super simplified explanation. What Forge had done is he had developed an adamantium suit of armor that Wolverine could use. And this combined with the Muramasa blade, which is a sword that actually contains a portion of Wolverine's soul, but the nature of the sword itself will actually shut down and basically neutralize and end the healing factor of anyone stabbed by it, allowed Wolverine to take the war directly to Sabretooth. Now, there are a couple of small things that did happen along the way, which is to say that Sabretooth was still connected to the pit and the powers within it, which is how Sabretooth had kind of amplified his abilities to a degree. And it also tormented Wolverine when he had at one point taken him to the pit. This also cost Wolverine his powers. When Phoebe had used her abilities, she had basically cut the connection between Sabretooth and the pit. So this effectively leveled the playing field. It was just Sabretooth as his normal self. Not only that, the armor that Wolverine possessed restored his healing factor, which meant now he was on an even playing field when it came to Sabretooth, or as even as a playing field can be when you're talking about wielding an adamantium suit of armor and a sword that can neutralize anybody's healing factor. But ultimately, in the final battle between the two, Wolverine quite literally cut Sabretooth into pieces. He chopped him up, and that killed Sabretooth. And so following this, Wolverine ended up taking off into the wilderness, which he usually does under situations like this. Whenever Wolverine finds himself in a group, he spends amount of time with that group, finds some measure of a home. Whenever things go sideways, as they usually always do, he ends up realizing, I can never really have a home. He just kind of sits around, he smokes some cigarettes and listens to The Cure, complains about how hard life is, and then takes off into the wilderness in northern Canada. Well, what ends up happening is that Wolverine is tracked down by a guy named Cyber, who is an old school villain of Wolverine. And in fact, he actually has adamantium-laced arms. The fight between Wolverine and Cyber isn't really the important part directly. It's actually what started to happen as a result of the fight between the two of them. As most of you guys are aware, when it comes to Wolverine, he has adamantium bonded to his skeleton. It's what we in comic books refer to as true adamantium, the first real instance of adamantium. The attempt by Myron McClane to duplicate Captain America's shield. Basically, he made adamantium unintentionally. In Marvel Comics, there's also a metal called adamantine, which is what Hercules' mace is made out of. It's a very old metal. This began the Call of the Adamantine storyline in Marvel, where essentially Marvel reworked the nature of adamantine itself to argue that it was an age-old metal and is kind of like the father metal, which is to say almost every metal material that exists on Earth in the main Marvel universe, and presumably even beyond, in some capacity originates or is tied to adamantine. And so in the fight between Cyber and Wolverine, there is a bit of adamantine in a cave that basically starts to wake up. The metal becomes sentient. And when that happens, it starts bonding itself to different people who historically have adamantium. The idea being that it's trying to find the kind of perfect warrior, quote unquote, to imbue its abilities. But while Wolverine is off doing his own thing in the aftermath of the fight with Cyber, Cyber himself, being more or less controlled by adamantine, starts traveling around. And the next person that he comes across in order to spread the adamantine to and to add to the ranks is Lady Deathstrike, one of the most notable enemies of Wolverine. Following this, Wolverine ends up in a fight with Constrictor, who has adamantium tendrils that he emits from his body, very similar to the same kind of tendrils that Omega Red has. And while Wolverine does win this fight, Lady Deathstrike shows up, confronts Constrictor, and then turns him into an adamantine-controlled individual. But because of the fact that adamantine is sentient and it has the ability to communicate with and take over the adamantium structure of anybody who has that metal, it starts sending these kind of mental projections into the mind of Wolverine, essentially talking to him, tormenting him, and almost arguing that Wolverine is this somewhat perfect being that is destined to bond with adamantine and become this perfect host for the adamantine metal. I do also want to specify here that adamantine itself does consider adamantium to be a false metal, but it doesn't necessarily mean that adamantine wants to kill everybody who's bonded to adamantium. The goal is to actually take them over, hence the reason for possession. But it's also the reason why you see these small instances, like when Wolverine and Nightcrawler and them catch up to Constrictor and Lady Deathstrike at a adamantium development site, and there's things like "Death to Adamantium" written on the wall by an adamantine-possessed Constrictor, because, again, the goal is to get rid of adamantium and replace adamantium with adamantine. Not only that, in the midst of all of this, and seemingly because of the fact that Wolverine's being targeted, and because she also felt the call of adamantine, Laura Kinney shows up here. Now, X-23 is not possessed. She's actually here to help Wolverine. But what ends up happening is she and Logan end up showing up to a data center out in Arizona, where they're confronted by Donald Pierce, who's also a long-standing enemy of the X-Men and possesses adamantium as well, only for us to find out he's also been taken by adamantine. But as it turns out, with Constrictor here, alongside Cyber and Lady Deathstrike, they've all been brought here for a particular reason, which is to say, being unified under the character of Romulus. Now, a little bit of a discussion here, because Romulus is one of the more interesting aspects of Wolverine's mythology, but he's one of these characters where, depending on what kind of origin you prefer for Wolverine, either you acknowledge him or you reject him entirely. So the old school origin of Wolverine in Marvel Comics is that he developed a healing factor at a very young age and popped his claws, they were made of bone, so on and so forth, and then eventually he was brought into Weapons Plus. Adamantium was bonded to his skeleton, and he becomes Wolverine as we know him. The motivation behind why that happened has changed over the years, which is to say, if you go and you read New X-Men from Grant Morrison, that there was a guy named John Sublime who realized that mutants would become a credible threat to both himself and the human population, and so John Sublime developed Weapons Plus, which started with Captain America as Weapon 1, and then went forward from there all the way up to Weapon X and beyond, with Weapon X being Wolverine. But in the aftermath of House of M, when the Scarlet Witch took away 98% of the mutant population's powers, as part of the event that basically set reality back to normal from House of M to the main Marvel Universe, Wolverine regained all his memories. This kick-started a line of comics by a guy named Daniel Way called Wolverine Origins, which was basically just a retelling of Wolverine's entire mythos. I will say, the story's fantastic if you choose to read it. There's one point where he actually infiltrates the White House, I'm pretty sure, using these just underground tunnels and bunkers and just craziness, right? But it was designed to show how capable Wolverine was, to the point that I think he actually walks by the Oval Office. I think there's a moment when that happens. But one of the big introductions that came during Wolverine Origins was Romulus. The way it's presented in Marvel Comics, although I will specify it's kind of enigmatic because Marvel's never really bothered to go super in depth into the story of Romulus, is that he is presumably an ancient being. And in fact, in Jeff Loeb's Wolverine Volume 3, issue number 53, Black Panther had hypothesized the idea that Romulus, unlike traditional humans, did not descend from apes. Instead, he seemed to descend from wolves. And the result was that Wolverine is just kind of a descendant of Romulus. At least that seemed to be the case. And that's why Romulus took such special interest in Wolverine. And so the idea presented to us is that it was actually Romulus who was the mastermind behind the Weapons Plus program, specifically Weapon X, and Adamantium being bonded to Wolverine. Again, it's one of these plot threads that's kind of on again, off again. It's to the point now in Marvel where a writer may or may not invoke it, and fans may or may not be receptive to it. But the long and short of it is that given his history within Marvel Comics, Romulus is a long game type of guy. And whenever he shows up, it's always designed to manipulate Wolverine in some capacity. But because of how capable he is, he's the one that's unifying all these people under the banner of Adamantine. Now, I do want to specify, it's not to say that Romulus is the mastermind here. He's a pawn just like everybody else, right? The real king in this game is Adamantine, but Adamantine perceives Romulus as being the true host of itself, as opposed to Wolverine, once Adamantine learned about Romulus's existence. And that's why the encounter between Wolverine and Romulus is really more of a test than anything else. In the here and now, Romulus has total control over Adamantine and is able to use that metal in its entirety, to the point that he's actually able to encase his entire body in adamantine metal. But again, it's a test just like everything else. And so in this fight between the two of them, the failure of Romulus comes in the fact that while he is able to coat his body with adamantine, he's not able to coat the inside of his mouth, which is his weak point, his Achilles heel. And that's what Wolverine uses. He literally plunges his claws through the mouth of Romulus and proves himself to be the victor. And so Adamantine, watching all of this unfold, leaves Romulus and then momentarily speaks to Wolverine. And in fact, it says things like, many champions have claimed to be one with their weapons, but you are truly united with yours. You are both wielder and weapon, and you cut down our avatar to save what mattered to you. Animal savagery with heroic purpose, false metal with true spirit. This is the kind of thing that Adamantine says to him. And that's when Adamantine takes on the form that it believes is most suitable to its role, which is to say, because it considers itself a warrior, ridding the world of false metals, it takes on the form of a warrior, which looks dope. And Wolverine initially goes to attack it, but Adamantine overcomes him like that, and then more or less says, I will be watching, and then leaves. And so that allows Wolverine to go on his own bit of a story, which honestly is really, really cool. So what ends up happening is that in the aftermath of all of this, Wolverine takes a bit of a reprieve where he's just laying up in this really, really cheap hotel. There's a knock at the door, and when he goes to answer, there is a letter written by his mother, Elizabeth Howlett, basically inviting him to come back to the Howlett estate. As soon as he gets out there, he's immediately met by Harpoon and Vertigo, both of whom are traditionally henchmen of Mr. Sinister, just old school villains of Wolverine. There's really not much doing here. I mean, he attacks them immediately and basically defeats them, but the lingering question here is why in the world would Vertigo and Harpoon ambush Wolverine like this? I mean, it just seems so uncharacteristic and so silly in a lot of ways. Not only that, once he gets into the house itself, he starts to pick up on Sabretooth's presence, which is kind of interesting here because Sabretooth is supposed to be dead. He does end up finding a body that's strung up inside the house, which turns out to be the sister of one of the guys at the bar that had tried to start a fight with Wolverine previously. Wolverine did encounter that guy in the house, and the guy was just saying things like, you know, he has my sister, he told me he would kill her if I didn't do what he told me to do. And so that's why when Wolverine showed up here, the guy immediately tried to attack him with a crowbar. As you can imagine, didn't work out too well. Wolverine just ended up sending the guy out, right? He was like, you know, why I oughta, you know, and then just like sent him out of the house, right? You know, sparing his life. But as he makes his way through here, he's suddenly met by the ghost of John Howlett and Thomas Logan, basically the groundkeepers. Thomas Logan being the actual father of Wolverine, having had an affair with his mother. But for the most part, they're specters, right? They're just ghosts that appear here to taunt him. But because of the fact that Wolverine is in a place where he's so mentally vulnerable, right? Emotionally vulnerable, they overtake him and torment him in a way that wouldn't normally happen if this just happened out there in the world somewhere. But once these specters are dealt with, essentially, Wolverine ends up hearing the voice of his mother from a room. He goes busting in there and finds her sitting there. But the problem is that once he gets into the room, Sabretooth immediately attacks. And the funny thing about this is that the question that a lot of us had was, how in the world did Sabretooth come back? The last time we saw him, he was literally cut into pieces. And seemingly, Saladin Ahmed, the guy who was writing this story, didn't really give us any explanation in terms of how Sabretooth returned. The closest we get to it is Sabretooth asking the question, haven't you ever wondered how it was that I came back? And Wolverine's like, oh, it's not the first time that you're too stupid to be dead. And that's it. But the fight between the two of them ends up making its way outside, and Wolverine, popping his claws, starts taking it to Sabretooth yet again and almost goes into a berserker rage in front of his mom, attacking Sabretooth and almost kills him, which essentially he does. The problem is that Sabretooth stands up and basically comes back to life again, which almost seemed to put out this idea that Sabretooth, by whatever manner and whatever means, is now effectively immortal. But it's not really the case. Wolverine ends up popping his claws, stabbing him through the head, and then Sabretooth dies again. And in that moment, Wolverine falls into the lap of his mother. He starts crying, right? Talking and asking questions like, why did you leave me alone? Kind of falling into this very vulnerable and almost childlike state, only for us to find out the whole thing is an illusion created by Jason Wingard, Mastermind. And I will say that Mastermind is one of the most slept on but powerful villains in Marvel Comics, because the reality here is that given his ability to manipulate the five senses, for the average person out there, there is no discernible difference between a high-level telepath and Mastermind, right? If you're just a person out there and he gets his clutches in you, it would be no different than if Charles Xavier just created an illusion inside your head. But with Mastermind, everything that you see, touch, smell, taste, and hear, it's 100% real. And that's why Wolverine is not easily able to escape the illusion. But then he starts to realize that none of it's true. And so when Wolverine kind of gets himself back together, gets his mom in a car, and they go to take off, that as they're driving, he passes the same hikers twice. And that right there immediately tells him they're going around in circles. But the problem is that the compass constantly says they're pointing east. And between those two things, he realizes someone's messing with his head. And that's when Mastermind essentially just starts breaking Wolverine down on a psychological level. And in fact, it actually turns out that the illusion of his mother wasn't real, that the drive wasn't real. He's been in the house the entire time. He never left. And that's the power of Jason Wyngarde. And of course, Wolverine, in realizing that the whole thing is an illusion, flips his lid and stabs Wyngarde with his claws. But then in that moment, he's stuck in this landscape full of Penrose steps, and his mother just starts taunting him, right? The voice of her, you're a devil spawn, I never should have had you, you're the worst mistake that I ever made, destroying him every opportunity on a psychological level. And that's the crazy thing about Wolverine, and really anybody facing off against someone like Jason Wyngarde. You don't know that when you kill him, that you actually have, or if it's an illusion. You don't know when you've actually won. And honestly, there's no way really to know, unless you're someone like Wolverine that does have a little bit of aid from somebody like Jean Grey, putting some measure of psychic blocks in place or something like that. But those are only really beneficial for someone with telepathic abilities. When you're somebody like Wolverine and you have heightened senses, you are a feast for someone like Jason Wyngarde. Telepathic blocks only get you so far, but as Wolverine starts breaking through these illusions, Jason Wyngarde starts to become more and more desperate. And that's usually the weakness of his character, is that he's incredibly powerful, but he's not the sharpest tool in the shed. Now, truth to tell, if something were to happen with Wyngarde, where his consciousness was expanded, or he somehow attained genius level intellect, it's game over for the Marvel Universe. This is a man that could dominate the world quite easily. It's something that I want to establish here. Jason Wyngarde is a mutant with a level of power that if the Marvel Cinematic Universe ever decided to make him into a villain to take over the world, it would be 100% believable. But at the end of the day, Wolverine casting through all the illusions and basically defeating Jason Wyngarde ends up leaving the house. And so at that point, the story cycles back into the events of the Call of Adamantine. And we end up learning that the adamantine metal itself, once it had left the cave, when it initially talked to Wolverine following the defeat of Romulus, had gone out into the world seeking out the perfect host, and it ultimately ended up locating Hercules. Because of the fact that Hercules' mace is made of adamantine, the adamantine metal used the mace of Hercules in order to work its way in and take over Hercules. At the same time that that's going on up in northwestern Canada, Wolverine ended up coming across a couple of mutants who were part of a community in this area of mutants who were just trying to stay safe from whatever humans out there may try to destroy them after the fall of Krakoa. And it actually turns out this group has hired Silver Sable to protect them. Silver Sable, of course, being a prodigious character. I will say this, if the time ever comes when she shows up in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, she'll be Black Widow 2.0. Silver Sable is amazing. She's a really, really cool character. Although I don't think that the Marvel Cinematic Universe can use her because I believe she's a Sony property at this point. But while Wolverine and Silver Sable develop some kind of a temporary relationship in the sense that they just start touching naughty bits for a little while, Wolverine ends up picking up on the scent of Romulus. When they get to him, they find Romulus has actually been cleaved in two, and that Hercules, possessed by adamantine, is standing there. A fight breaks out between the two of them, and Hercules starts dominating Wolverine. But the kicker is that in the midst of this fight, Athena shows up. Right? And Athena kind of gives us this somewhat prophecy that exists out there and saying that adamantine really is an ancient metal. It's been around since the dawn of Earth itself, and that it has been wielded in some capacity by various people over the years, but the only real way that adamantine can be defeated is by an individual who's a kind of perfect combination of man and beast and metal, which of course is hitting to Wolverine. His animalistic nature and his animalistic senses, the fact that he is a sentient man who can think for himself, and the fact that adamantium is bonded to his skeleton. So in effect, he's the one destined to defeat adamantine. And so with Hercules temporarily, removed of his possession by the adamantine metal, this leads to Wolverine and Hercules traveling to a development facility in the South China Sea, where basically adamantine is just like destroying another adamantium-based manufacturing plant. And it's kind of funny because when Wolverine and Hercules show up here, they get dominated right off the bat. They just get crushed. It's not even any real measure of a conflict because you're talking about a metal that is nigh indestructible, right? To the point that not even Wolverine's adamantium can stand against it. And in fact, this happens when Adamantine takes out Hercules, literally knocks him unconscious, and then Wolverine goes in for an attack with his adamantium claws, and his claws shatter on the adamantine metal. Or at least the claws on one of his hands shatter on the metal. And so with Adamantine standing over Wolverine, and with every intention of killing him, suddenly the Savage Champions show up. And the Savage Champions are just like this new introduction in the story. Seemingly, the fight between Wolverine and Adamantine seems to happen in almost every universe. It's not fully fleshed out here. They show up for a moment, and they tell Wolverine, in your fight with the adamantine, it has called us here. Now, the connection to this actually came by way of the prophecy of Athena, that because Wolverine is this perfect blend of man, metal, and animal, in effect, he is a savage champion. And so he's effectively called other savage champions to him, even if he did it unintentionally. And so with the four of them working together, they basically end up defeating the adamantine metal. And for the moment, it's destroyed. And then the other three just jump back into a portal and leave. It's quite literally like a 4-page moment. It's not like this great big huge 6-issue storyline where Wolverine teams up with the savage champions. No, that's not what happens at all. It's just a very momentary thing. But after that, the story actually gets really fun. And this is what's happening right now. This is the story that's being published, like, as of this moment in Marvel Comics. That in the aftermath of the battle with Adamantine, and with one of his claws reduced down to basically shattered bone, so literally stubs, essentially, that Wolverine and Nightcrawler end up going on a vacation. And when they get there, Titania and Absorbing Man are there. And Absorbing Man's had a vendetta against Wolverine ever since Wolverine cut his arm off during Secret Wars. Not only that, when it comes to Titania, this is a big woman. Absorbing Man is the only person that I know of in Marvel Comics who has ever climbed Mount Titania and come back for seconds, to be honest with you guys. But the moment is hilarious because they just happen to be in the same place at the same time. And honestly, it kind of makes Wolverine look like a dick, because as soon as Absorbing Man, Crusher Creel, sees Wolverine, he's like, "You son of a bitch," and then like immediately goes to attack him. He's like, "He cut off my arm like 20 years ago. I hate that guy." But Crusher Creel, much like Mastermind, is a criminally underrated villain in Marvel Comics. Any material he touches, he can absorb. And in fact, there was actually a point in Marvel when he absorbed a cosmic cube. The point is that in the fight with Wolverine, he actually absorbs Wolverine's adamantium. He doesn't take it from him. It's just that Crusher Creel becomes adamantium, but he does punch Wolverine. And so the fight doesn't really end with like one of them being destroyed or anything like that. In fact, it just kind of starts laying waste to like this section of the resort. And it kind of leads to a momentary fight between Nightcrawler and Titania. But at the end of the day, saner heads prevail, and this leads to everybody calming down. And that's when you realize Wolverine is kind of a dick, but so is Crusher Creel, because Titania talks about how for somebody like Wolverine, they've got all the X-Men money that exists out there, you know, from courtesy of Xavier's entire family wealth, and so they can just travel whenever they want to, however they want to. But for Titania and Crusher Creel, it took them like 2 years of saving just to be able to afford this vacation, which kind of makes you a little bit sad. But then you remember that Crusher Creel was the one who started the fight in the first place. So how sad could you really be? So that leads to like Crusher Creel and Titania going off and doing their own thing. But what's happening in the here and now is that Wolverine realizes he's not healing, because what Crusher Creel had seemingly done is when he hit Wolverine, he didn't just absorb the ability to copy his adamantium, he also absorbed his healing factor. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. That's what's happening in the Wolverine comics as of right now. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know if you want me to catch you up on anybody else since the Age of Krakoa, and I will catch you all later. Peace.